Today we have a really exciting program. We have as our main speaker Professor Vítor Gaspar, who is a special advisor at Banco de Portugal, Portuguese central bank. Has been recently nominated in June, will assume the position as director of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the International Monetary Fund. And he was Minister of Finance in Portugal from mid-2011 to mid-2013. He was also, before that, special advisor to Banco de Portugal. He was head of the Bureau of European Policy Advisors of the European Commission from January 2007 to February 2010. He has been an academic, and from 1989 to 1992, he was Director of Economic Studies at the Ministry of Finance. His research and his work, which includes numerous articles in prestigious academic policy-oriented journals and in books, deals with macroeconomic policy, public economics, political economy, and financial regulation. And he has agreed to come and speak to us today on a research project that he's been working on, dealing with the making of a continental financial system, lessons for Europe from early American history. So this is nice. We're early American history, lessons for Europe, rather than the other way around that people normally think about where the lessons come from and where people have moved to. We're also very fortunate that Professor Richard Sylla, the Henry Kaufman Professor of History of Financial Institutions and Markets and Professor of Economics at New York University, Stern School of Business, has agreed to come and provide his insight. He is the Nestor of the profession in this area. He really is a renowned historian, economic historian, has published again in the leading journals and has been at NYU since 1990. Before that, he taught at the University of Pennsylvania, North Carolina State University, and has been studying at numerous institutions around the world, including the Indian Statistical Institute at Calcutta. So we're very pleased to have these two renowned speakers here. And we will have a presentation first, then the discussion between the two. I will moderate sort of as my capabilities permit, and then we'll open it up for discussion with all of you. So, Vitor, welcome very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to start exactly thanking you, Jan, for your very kind words, and the Center on Global Economic Governance for hosting me during this week, and especially for giving me the opportunity to present this research on Alexander Hamilton's experience as first Treasury Secretary, and what can we learn in Europe from that experience. Talking about Alexander Hamilton at Columbia is particularly exciting, given that Alexander Hamilton was a student here. At the time it was called King's College, and then he was instrumental in the reopening of the college after the War of Independence and the transformation of the King's College into Columbia. Now, the reason I focused on Alexander Hamilton was probably because after having left my job as Minister of Finance in Portugal, I thought that focusing on American history was safe enough. And that was probably the motivation. But I got very excited about it, and I started drawing what I think are important lessons for Europe, and the project became more relevant than I was planning. Now, I'm extremely honored, and I think it's absolutely excellent that Professor Richard Sylla has agreed to come, because he's a world leader in the field of financial history. He has published very important research on this very period, and I am told that he's a great admirer of Alexander Hamilton, perhaps even to excess, I was told.
Impossible.
So, I will try to be as brief as I possibly can, because I'm eager to listen to Professor Sylla, and I would like very much to engage with you on this, that to me is a very exciting topic. Now, I will start with a brief motivation. Then I will give you my starting point, which was Tom Sargent's Nobel lecture. And then I will try to explain why the challenge to Alexander Hamilton was so difficult. And then I will conclude with 5 lessons, and I will try to explain what Alexander Hamilton did and what we can learn from it at one go, in one go. Now, the first point, which is very important, is that the political process, the financial process, and public finance are very much linked. Alexander Hamilton is very inspiring and is somebody who is very easy to study because he wrote his version of things himself. He wrote a lot. And in particular, he wrote immediately when he started his job as first Treasury Secretary. He wrote a report on public debt that he submitted to Congress. And there he asked questions like, why pay for the public debt? How can public credit be established? How to speed up confidence and trust, and how to maintain public credit. In the process of managing the Treasury, he also had to tackle the very practical question of how to restore financial stability in the face of a financial panic. And in doing so, he anticipated the lender of last resort doctrine of Bagehot and Thornton. Now, in Europe, we have been in a situation of financial crisis since 2007, and that financial crisis transformed itself or mutated into a sovereign debt crisis from the end of 2009, and that challenge has persisted. The US federal government has never defaulted on its debt. The US is a well-functioning, well-integrated monetary union. Therefore, it is reasonable to expect that we can learn a lot from the experience of the US. And here in this talk, we will concentrate on the early days of that experience. We will concentrate on the early days. I started being very interested in this topic in the summer because I came across and became fascinated by Thomas Sargent Nobel lecture, which has a very appealing title, US Then, Europe Now, which is basically what we will be talking about. In terms of the ground cover in Sargent's lecture, we're going to concentrate on just a tiny bit of the period he covered. Basically, the period from 1789 to 1795, which was when Alexander Hamilton was Treasury Secretary. Now, the starting point is the fundamentals of the government's intertemporal budget constraint. That's from Sargent. We have a primary surplus, which is the difference between TT, which is revenues in general, and GT is government expenditures. So ST, the primary surplus, is the difference between tax revenues minus government expenditures that do not include interest payments. Equation 2 is simply the equation of debt accumulation, Treasury bonds 1 period ahead, B T plus 1. equal the 1 plus I, the capitalization factor, times the stock of public debt minus the primary surplus. And the interesting part is that one can solve this equation 2 backwards and forwards, which is standard. But the interesting bit is the interpretation. Now, we basically have in equation 3, probably I should show you the equation 3, we have that the current level of debt is the accumulated value of past primary deficits plus the initial, the capitalized value of the initial level of debt. So you explain the level of public debt today by accumulated past deficits. But in order for the debt to be served, one needs to have it equal to the present discounted value of future surpluses. And Tom Sargent emphasizes that equation 4 can be seen as a debt valuation equation. That is, the public debt can only be worth the value of the resources which are used to repay it. So that's a debt valuation equation. And that's basically what I have in the first 2 indents in this slide. But for the forward-looking equation is much more complicated an object than it looks, because ST, the primary surplus, is a process which in itself is the outcome of a political process. And we, economists, are not particularly good at modeling outcomes of political processes. Now, one of the aspects that comes from the value of debt deriving from future primary surpluses is that the value of debt depends on expectations. And since it depends on expectations that agents form on the basis of some priors and some information set, there is the possibility of multiple equilibria, which is a very important challenge, both in terms of theoretical modeling and in terms of policy making. Now, it turns out that the first formal attempt to model the possibility of multiple self-fulfilling equilibria that I know of was due to Guillermo Calvo in a paper that he published in 1988 in the American Economic Review, in which he addresses the role of expectations in public debt management. That paper has been followed by many other contributions by Cole and Keogh, Bassetto, Rush and Uhlig, All of this and others have modeled the possibility of multiple equilibria. And we will spend some time discussing the policy implications of these possibilities. Now, the literature also has some other strands which are worth mentioning. I will only mention 3. Arellano and Ito and Gersowitz model the decision to default as a strategic decision made by an optimizing government. Leeper and al. Are the ones that have come closer to modeling political constraints for solvency. They look at something that looks very much like a Laffer curve, but then they modify the Laffer curve to take into account political constraints and discuss debt sustainability in that context. Finally, there is a literature that started from Bonn that looks at fiscal policy rules and establishes that if the primary surplus responds sufficiently strongly to the level of public debt, then it is possible to ensure sustainability. Now, clearly, this literature did not exist at the time of Alexander Hamilton, but it is fascinating to realize that most of the policy implications from this literature were, at least it seems to me, very well understood by Alexander Hamilton. Now, the key challenge faced by Alexander Hamilton was to ensure debt service, and the debt service came from the debt which had been accumulated during the War of Independence. Now, the situation at the beginning, so in the 70s, 80s, looked hopeless because the Continental Congress had the power to issue debt. Supposedly, it could also get resources from the states, but the states had to decide exactly how those resources would be mobilized. And since that amounted to a requirement of unanimity, unanimity was not forthcoming, and so there was a gridlock, and that was effectively in default. Now, the U.S. Constitution of 1788 replaced the Articles of the Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution strengthened the ability of the federal government to tax and gave the central government the federal government, exclusive competence to regulate external trade and interstate commerce, the so-called Commerce Clause. Given that public finance at this point in history was dominated by tariffs, the two things were very closely linked. Now, the U.S. federal government took over the debt of the states, which was about 1/3 of the total amount outstanding at the time. And one can wonder whether the simple fact of allocating powers to the federal government solved the issue of debt sustainability. And I'm going to argue that that is definitely not the case. Now, a small detour that you will allow. Alexander Hamilton, as I already said, was Treasury Secretary from 1789 to 1795, and he was responsible for the transition from a bankrupt Treasury to a modern, stable financial system. This is actually characterized by Richard Sylla in his research, and in a paper with co-authors, he characterizes the main characteristics of this financial system using 6 elements: stable public finances and competent public debt management, a stable currency, a central bank, an effective banking system, active security markets, and a procedure for the incorporation of financial and non-financial businesses. They stress that in 1789, none of these 6 elements was in place, and that when Hamilton left the Treasury, all of them were in place. Another point, which is also very much emphasized by Richard Sylla, is that at the beginning, in 1789, in 1790, the situation did not look at all promising. And Sylla, in his research, uses a number of figures to characterize the situation. So, rounding things, public debt was about 80 million at the time, and that was about 40% of GDP. 2/3 of the debt was federal, 1/3 states. Under the contractual arrangements, interest payments due were about 4.6 million. Hamilton estimates in the first report on public credit that I already quoted that the operating expenditures of the federal government were about $600,000. They turned out to be $829,000, but the difference is not material. Interest payments alone were about 85% of total expenditures. And in 1790, which is the first full year in which the new federal government was in operation, total government revenues were 1.64 million. Interest payments, not interest rates, interest payments were almost 3 times tax revenues. In 1789, so at the time it started, the lack of credibility of the ability of federal government to serve the debt was very clear, because the market value of these bonds traded at 20% of nominal value for the bonds and 12.5% for the indents, and the indents were assets that were issued to recognize that interest payments were late, had not been honored. So at that point in time, the debt traded at deep discounts, and technically the federal government was already in default. So the situation was not at all promising. So I will now try to go as quickly as I can through the lessons, and I will try to argue how Hamilton did solve a number of very important challenges. Now, Alexander Hamilton clearly recognized that fiscal policy, finance, and politics go together. If you read his contributions, which of course most of you have, you see not only that he writes well and is a very clear thinker, he's also a systemic thinker. The various bits and pieces match in a very harmonious way in the proposals that Alexander Hamilton puts forward and then implements. The solution for these problems involved the Constitution of 1788, and that provides the basis for the political and institutional solution that was applied in the United States. Now, concerning the implementation of this program, one of the questions which is more prominent in the first report on public credit is the answer to the question, why pay for the public debt? That was a question which was very lively debated in the US at the time, and Alexander Hamilton goes through a very elaborate process of arguing that honoring the public debt is in the US best interest. He basically uses a number of narrow financial arguments, including that sustaining public finances allows for tax smoothing. And tax smoothing, which is of course an expression he did not use, constitutes a strategic advantage. The main reason for tax smoothing at the time was war, and countries that could get credit in times of war had a very strong strategic advantage. And Hamilton uses the example of England versus France. England had access to credit, France did not. England won wars, France lost them. Then Hamilton argues that the US needs capital, needs to import capital from the rest of the world. And having sound public credit facilitates, in Hamilton's view, international financing. Thirdly, the fact that there is sound public credit and a trusted asset issued by the U.S. Treasury made it easier for the domestic financial system to develop. And financial development, in turn, led to the fourth consideration, which was that that was important to finance agriculture, manufacturing, and trade. And we today would say that it's something which is important for innovation and entrepreneurship. But quite apart from this narrow financial and economic arguments, Hamilton used also broad political arguments. He was very concerned about political stability, and he was fully aware that the French Revolution had at its roots problems of unsustainability of public finance, and of course, the use of violence in the US associated with fiscal problems was a reality at the time. But perhaps the most important argument is that Hamilton argues, following Adam Smith, that sound public credit is an indicator of the overall quality of governance. That is, a government that is not capable of sustaining public credit will, in general, not be able to deliver good governance to society as a whole. So there is a systemic aspect associated with this. Interestingly, this grammar of arguments from Hamilton maps very well into recent empirical research by Cruces and Trebesch that has just come out in the American Journal of Macroeconomics, if I'm not mistaken. Oops. Public credit must be grounded on the fundamentals of fiscal sustainability. That's the point which is most emphasized by Sargent, and it's clearly very important. We have already mentioned it, so we move on. Now, the point is that if we look at Europe, we also have a situation where the fundamentals of fiscal sustainability are enshrined in European law, so-called six-pack and the two-pack. But the point I want to emphasize is that since Europe is made by sovereign states, the piece which seems to me more important is the fiscal compact. The fiscal compact basically has the rules of the six-pack enshrined, but the difference is that the fiscal compact foresees that those rules have to be adopted at domestic national level. And since in Europe the dimension of politics which is dominant is national, it's only at the national level that these rules and procedures can be effective, or so I think. But this is one of the issues that, at least in Europe, is most often discussed. The lessons which are, I would say, more exciting and where I depart a little bit from what I've read in the literature have to do with the management of the transition. That's lesson 4, in the sense that Alexander Hamilton managed the transition very successfully, and he was able to manage expectations with tremendous skill. What did he do in terms of managing the transition? Well, he built the fiscal capacity of the US federal government. And again, Professor Sylla has a time series of tax revenues that he got from a Dutch creditor who collected the information in the context of the 18th century version of due diligence. And it's very clear that the capacity was being built very quickly. He engineered a very successful market-based debt reduction scheme in which he was able to reduce the interest payments of federal government from 4.6 million to 3.6 million, which is a considerable reduction. And this was done quickly and reasonably smoothly. He created a sinking fund that was fed by resources from the post office. But the most important thing is that this sinking fund was able to issue debt and basically got loans from foreign creditors, and the funds available were used to intervene in bond markets in order to stabilize bond markets and accelerate the transition. And finally, he also managed a number of minor financial incidents and the financial panic of 1792, but that is something that we will cover in the fifth lesson. So I will move to Europe. Now, in Europe, when the crisis started, there were no procedures in place for the management of the financial crisis. During the course of this crisis, a number of mechanisms and financial instruments were put in place. At this point, we have the European Stability Mechanism, which is a fund that can support member states in trouble. We have decided to advance towards banking union. We have the single supervisory mechanism being prepared to enter into full operation still this year. But the key moment was in the summer of 2012, when in quick sequence, the heads of state and government decided to advance in the direction of genuine economic and monetary union, including banking union. And a few weeks later, the president of the ECB made the famous speech in London in which he stressed that the ECB would do whatever it takes within its mandate to ensure, to preserve the euro. And he added, believe me, it will be enough. Now, when I started going around discussing the crisis of the euro area, and that was in the early autumn of 2013, the risk of euro area fragmentation was no longer a relevant consideration in the eyes of market players. Now, clearly, our last lesson is that accidents will happen. Hamilton managed the increase in credibility so well that there was an overreaction in the price of bonds. There was financial euphoria in 1791, 1792, and eventually in 1792 there was a panic. In this context, as again was documented by Richard Sylla and co-authors, Hamilton anticipates the Bagehot-Thornton doctrine of lender of last resort. Now, he basically does it through the banking system. He uses as his instruments the Bank of New York and the Bank of the United States that had been created. He recommends to these institutions that they should lend enormous amounts to whoever would come with good collateral, and the operations were to be made at 7%, which was a penalty rate, which was above 6%, which was the prevailing rate at the time. But the twist of Alexander Hamilton was the definition of good collateral. Good collateral was, and I guess you have guessed it by now, was U.S. Treasury bonds. He goes as far as to recommend at which prices they should be accepted as collateral, which meant that whoever had U.S. Treasury bonds had access to liquidity in a financial panic. And by doing so, Hamilton made the U.S. Treasuries emerge as the ultimate safe asset in the U.S. Financial system. And he was able to be successful in the ultimate test, which is the management of a financial panic. In Europe, despite the progress that I've reported, we are still working on it. But I want to finish with a quote from Alexander Hamilton that I think, also from 1790, that I think it's very inspiring from a European perspective. He wrote, "Whoever considers the nature of our government with discernment will see that though obstacles and delays will frequently stand in the way of the adoption of good measures, yet when once adopted, they are likely to be stable and permanent. It will be far more difficult to undo than to do." This is something that has been true in Europe during this crisis, and this point about being much harder to undo than to do is the most important guarantee that we can offer that the current challenges that are being faced by the euro area will be overcome. Thank you.
Professor Sylla, I invite you to make some remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to be here today, even though it's a bit of a rush since I had a class that ended at 12:15 and I have another 3-hour class that goes from 6 to 9 tonight. So I probably won't hang around too much to chat with you afterwards, but get ready for that next class. Well, I think one of the pleasures here today is having a European come in and talk about the early United States and person I regard as the most prominent of the founding fathers. Probably I would get a lot of disagreement on that, but Columbia grad, not grad, he didn't graduate, and it wasn't Columbia, it was King's College, and he didn't graduate, but let's say Columbia's most prominent son. And this is part of a long tradition in our country. In our country, we do not actually appreciate Alexander Hamilton as much as we should for various reasons. You know, Washington has his fans, Franklin has his fans, Jefferson has his fans. You know, there are even people like David McCullough that have John Adams as a hero. And I noticed that Lynn Cheney, remember Dick Cheney's wife, Lynn Cheney, has just published a book about James Madison, how he's such a great guy. Hamilton somehow, you know, the left doesn't like him because he was for big business. And the right doesn't like him because he was for big government. So it's very easy to find reasons not to like Alexander Hamilton. But that's the way we view it in America. There's a long tradition in Europe of looking at it a different way. The sources are not always unimpeachable. One of the very earliest ones was a chap named Talleyrand, who was, I view Talleyrand as a survivor, but he was considered to be a rather cold-hearted fellow. He actually came to America in the 1790s to avoid having his head chopped off in France, and came to know Hamilton and admire what Hamilton did. And later on in life, after he'd worked for the revolutionaries and Napoleon, and I guess he straightened out had protected France's interests at the Congress of Vienna. Late in life, Talleyrand said the three greatest statesmen of his time were Napoleon, Pitt, the British Prime Minister, and Hamilton, and that of the three, there was no doubt at all in his mind that Hamilton was the greatest of those three. So that's a European view. You go 100 years later, there is Lord Bryce, the Scottish scholar and diplomat. James Bryce wrote a book called The American Commonwealth, and if you read that book, he talks about Washington being sort of above it all, a really admirable figure. But he said the figure of Hamilton is by far the most interesting to a European, that Hamilton to a European is the most interesting of all these people because he had this military competence, financial competence, he was a great lawyer, and so on. So now Victor comes along, more than 100 years later, another European who has made a rather intensive study. I mean, if you're really interested in this, I would ask you to get a copy of Victor's paper because he has some of the juiciest quotes from Hamilton, lengthy quotes from Hamilton. One I noticed in particular is a paragraph from a letter Hamilton wrote in 1780. I read it to my students in the class I'm going to teach tonight. I mean, it was a month ago. I read the chapter, and there's several students from the NYU Law School in the class. And I read this paragraph from Hamilton. I think it's on page 13 of your paper, Victor. Mm-hmm. And I said, does this remind you of anything? And the law students right away raised their hands and said, boy, that sounds just like Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which wasn't written until 7 years later. So there's a paragraph in a Hamilton letter of 1780 that sort of sounds like Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. The law students picked up on it immediately. So I think, I think that I admire Victor's scholarship here and delving deeply into Hamilton, not just having the sort of toss-offs that Americans do. Oh, he was for big business, and so I don't like him, or maybe he was for big business, so I do like him, or he was for big government, so I like him, or he's for big government, so I don't like him. That's where Americans come down. Victor brings out, he was a very deep thinker, a very skilled financier. He knew how to put things together. Systemic plan, I think you call it. That's certainly true, that he was doing a lot of the thinking of that time. And you're drawing these lessons for Europe from Hamilton's experience. And I can kind of go along with that, but I think you may be a bit too optimistic. Maybe both about how easy it was to do this in America and how easy it's going to be for Europe to do it today. My most recent paper, which hasn't been published yet, but I brought a copy along, I'm going to give it to Victor. It'll be out sometime later this year. It's an article called Early U.S. Struggles with Fiscal Federalism, Lessons for Europe. It sounds a little bit like your title. So here you are. We're going to get together tomorrow, not today because I have to go teach this class at NYU, but tomorrow Victor and I are going to get together. So you have 24 hours to read the paper, Victor, and there'll be a 10-minute quiz when we meet tomorrow.
That's fine. Looking forward.
Well, anyway, in this paper, I did it actually to make Europeans feel a little bit better. I went to a conference in Dubrovnik last June, not quite a year ago, and then things weren't quite as happy as they seem to be getting now. So the Europeans were kind of worried about their future. And I wanted to cheer them up by saying, because Europe has become great admirers of Hamilton. A lot of people are talking about Hamilton. John Trichet was, who you mentioned in your paper, was sort of seen carrying around a book, Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton, because somebody told Trichet when he was head of the European Central Bank that he ought to read up on Hamilton. So he was seen carrying Chernow's biography around with him. And there have been a lot of writings from people in Europe about Hamilton's applicability over there. Well, I knew that Hamilton, yes, he did the great things Victor talked about, but they weren't so easy to do. It turns out that this paper is about the 1780s, and there was a predecessor of Alexander Hamilton named Robert Morris, who was appointed by Congress to be the superintendent of finance in 1781, at a time when the paper money issued by the revolutionaries had gone, before the assignats, it went the way of the assignats. It was overissued. Famous phrase in American lore is not worth a continental. It was called the continental currency, and it basically was overissued. So Morris came in to straighten out that situation, and he tried to do all the things Hamilton successfully did later on, but Morris failed. I guess this to show it wasn't quite as easy as it might seem by just looking at Hamilton. The way to think about that, I think if Victor had it in his slides, my sort of model of what a modern financial system is, the 6 key components. Just to refresh your memory, strong public finances and debt management on the part of the government. You want to have a stable money. You want to have a central bank. You ought to have a banking system, securities markets, and a system of chartering corporations. This is what I call the 6 key components of a modern financial system. And Victor, in my view, is quite right. I hope it's not just based on my own writings, but he's quite right when he says the U.S. had none of these in 1788, and it had all of them by 1795. That's the amazing thing Hamilton did. I sometimes call this the most important development in American history that most of you never heard of. The fact that we had a primitive financial system in 1788, and just a few years later, maybe even by 1792, but certainly by the time Hamilton stepped down in 1795, the U.S. has all of these things. Victor talked about the stable public credit. He didn't say too much about the new currency in the world, the United States dollar, defined both in terms of gold and silver by Hamilton and becoming the base of the monetary system. There was no central bank in 1788. There was a Bank of the United States in 1795. It was a branch bank. It had branches in different places around the country. The banking system, there were 2 or 3 banks, one in Boston, one in New York, one in Philadelphia in the 1780s. One had been founded by Morris, the very first bank, called the Bank of North America in Philadelphia. But these banks, the Boston Bank, the New York Bank, and the Philadelphia Bank, had nothing to do with each other. There was no banking system. They were just local banking institutions that took deposits and made loans. By 1795, the states have chartered something like 25 banks. The Bank of the United States there is with its offices in different cities. And now banks are receiving each other's checks and so on. You have a banking system. Securities markets, there were some sporadic, sparse securities markets going on in the 1780s to trade the debt in default, usually at 10 or 20 cents on the dollar, 10 or 20% of face value. But by 1795, you have stock exchanges, much smaller than today, in New York and Philadelphia, a stock market in Boston. New Yorkers, probably some of you have heard. If you haven't heard, you should visit the Museum of American Finance at 48 Wall Street. Tell them I sent you. I'm the chairman, and they may let you in for nothing, or go on Saturday. It's 1 block away from the New York Stock Exchange, and New Yorkers, I think, are familiar with when did the New York Stock Exchange come along? It came along when the brokers met under the buttonwood tree in May 17, 1792, in the wake of that financial panic, because New York, as always happens, New York passed some restrictive legislation telling the people they couldn't sell securities in the streets. So the brokers said, well, we're not going to stop selling securities. What we have to do is go indoors and, do things among consenting adults that they won't let us do in the street anymore. So that was the origin of the New York Stock Exchange in 1792. But it was also because the volume of trading of government bonds and stocks had gone up so much that they needed to have a better trading system. I've written a bit about that in some of my writings. So you had securities markets, and then the corporations. I actually spent probably too much time in recent years counting all the corporations that were created in the United States between 1790 and 1860. A scholar 100 years ago had done some earlier work and did the 1790s, and his name was Joseph S. Davis, in a book called Essays on the Early History of American Corporations. Still, 100 years later, it's still a book worth reading. It's very good scholarship. He found that there were 7 corporations, I'm talking about business corporations now, chartered in colonial America between Jamestown and 1780. In the 1780s, it picked up a little bit. There were 28 corporations chartered in the 1780s, 4 times what had been chartered in the colonial period. But then in Hamilton's, what I call Hamilton's financial revolution, starting in 1791 and 1792, 40 corporations were chartered in those 2 years, and that was more than in all previous American history put together to that time. By the end of the 1790s, 300 corporations have been chartered. We've only counted the ones that were chartered by individual acts of the state legislatures between 1790 and 1860, and that number comes out to be 22,419. No doubt we missed some, so I shouldn't be so surprised, but say 23,000 maybe, assuming our research assistants missed some of them. Plus there were another 7,000 or 8,000 chartered under a relatively new thing, which is the standard today, the general incorporation law. So the U.S. is what one of my colleagues just wrote a book on this, one person who worked with me on this research. It's called Corporation Nation. The U.S. is the first corporation nation. This sheer numbers of corporations, vastly greater than you would find in England or France or Prussia at the time. The numbers, they're just off the charts. Many of these were small corporations, but that was part of Hamilton's plan. All these things didn't happen by accident. I mean, I think Hamilton had planned this and structured his policies to make them happen. 3 of my 6 key components of a financial system, namely straightening out the government revenues and expenditures and debt management, creating the dollar, and creating the central bank, he could directly do as Treasury Secretary. He had the authority. But to form a banking system, form securities markets all over the place, and get corporations going, those were going to be done by somebody else. The banks were going to be chartered by the states. Other corporations would be chartered by the states. Securities markets would be a product of the brokers acting in their own interests and investors. But Hamilton knew if I get the first 3 right, if I create a good national debt and I create a lot of good stock in a Bank of the United States, that's going to create the raw materials for people to form securities markets. And if I extol the wisdom of banking, Victor, I'm glad he mentioned entrepreneurship and so on, because Hamilton thought, Hamilton said early on, you didn't pick up on this quote, but banks are the happiest engines that were ever invented for advancing trade. Hamilton, and that was at a time, Hamilton said that, when there were no banks in the country. And so how did this immigrant from the West Indies, who never lived in a place where there were banks, how could he be saying things like that at the American founding? Well, that's one of the problems I have in trying to understand how he could comprehend the importance of finance when there was so little of it around him. This is one of the great mysteries of Hamilton, and probably part of his genius was to read up and put 2 and 2 together and figure out that this is what we needed. Anyway, Morris tried to do all those things. He tried to straighten out the public finances, but as Victor mentioned, he couldn't get the tax revenue needed to make any dent in the government debt, much less the paying even the expenses of the government. So the debt's in default through the 1780s. He tried to have a monetary reform. That didn't work either. He thought his Bank of North America might be a central bank, but after the fighting was over, he sold the shares the government owned, and it just became a Philadelphia bank. Banking system, he didn't make any progress on that. organized securities markets, he made no progress on that. Very little progress, as already mentioned, on corporations. Hamilton made a big change when he came in. That all the things that Morris tried to do and failed, Hamilton was able to do. So now, what accounts for this change? And this is where I have some doubts about what Victor is arguing. And if I'm not misrepresenting him, I'll say that you're saying that we can study Hamilton, and in Europe today, we've sort of absorbed these lessons and we're ready to go forward. Things are looking better. This is what I'm not so sure of. That I would say my optimism about Europe would have to be tempered based on what I know about the U.S. The big change there was the Constitution that comes through in what you're saying. And of course, that's what Hamilton had. Robert Morris didn't have that. Now, this didn't just fall into Hamilton's lap. Hamilton was the first of these founding fathers that I know of. In 1780, he said, the government we have now won't work. Congress ought to be more assertive, but they're too timid. So the next best thing, Hamilton says in September 1780, is we ought to call immediately a convention of the states to write a better plan of government. This is what happened at Philadelphia 7 years later. And in the words incorporated some of the stuff Hamilton wrote in 1780. But he worked harder than anyone to bring about the Constitution. And so he wasn't just luckier than Morris that the Constitution was there. Hamilton said we needed the Constitution. He worked for the Constitution, and then when it was enacted, he took advantage of it to enact the things Victor was talking about, or to push them along. Now, what did the Constitution do? It centralized the government of the United States. And if you listen to Victor carefully, he was saying the great thing about Europe today is that we're going to do all this recognizing the sovereignty of the individual countries there. We're going to have six-packs and two-packs and so on, and these apparently are deals that have made between individual countries like Portugal and maybe the Central Bank and the European Union and the World Bank or the IMF or whatever. And it's sort of the deal is that now these individual states are going to behave themselves. The Portuguese and the Greeks are now going to be more responsible than they were before. Hamilton, if you take out the nations there and you put in the states, you could be saying that it's like the U.S. If only Rhode Island and Virginia and New York had behaved themselves better in the 1780s, we might have been able to do all these things. And so I'm going to just close, because I think we can have a really good discussion of this, and I don't want to take too much time. See, in my view, I could be wrong, but I would temper my optimism, because in my view, Europe today is like the U.S. was in the 1780s before the Constitution. And the Europeans have tried to have a Constitution, and they haven't done it. And America couldn't get one then because, or even national action of any sort of bold nature, such as happened after Hamilton took charge, because the states would, Victor mentioned the unanimity rule. I mean, 12 of the 13 states agreed with Robert Morris by 1782 that the national government ought to have a tax revenue, and they were ready to approve a 5% tax on imports. But one state, Rhode Island, said no. And so you couldn't do that. You couldn't get this unified action. Victor's kind of optimistic that the European states today, nations, are going to fall in line and behave themselves. But, if we had 13 colonies and we couldn't get unanimity, how many states are there in the Eurozone or the European Union? This is 25?
18. EU is
18.
28.
The EU is 28, and the EZ, the Eurozone, is
Euro area is 18.
18. So there, you have an even more states there to fall into line on all this. And I'm a little bit, I hope it works out. I hope you're right, Victor, that, these six-packs and two-packs are going to work out properly. But based on what I know about the United States in the 1780s, I think that's a little bit closer to where Europe is now, and it didn't work out so well then until people bit the bullet. You had to have a Shays rebellion and things like that, and states putting tariffs on imports from other states, things like in the states beginning to print paper money again. All these scary things were happening, and that's what drove the Philadelphia Convention to write a stronger plan of government. And I think maybe, at least based on the American parallel, maybe something like that will have to happen in Europe before these problems will go away. I hope I'm wrong, I hope you're right, but I just want to temper the optimism that you have brought to us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I suggest we give Vitor a chance to respond quickly while you're preparing your questions. We have a microphone over there, so after that, step to the microphone, just identify yourself very briefly and keep your comments, questions to the minimum so we can get as many people as possible to participate.
So thanks a lot for your comments. I will study your paper very carefully as required, and you can drill me on it tomorrow. It's absolutely fine. Concerning optimism, I'm guilty as charged. I'm a very optimistic person with a very sunny disposition, so I have that kind of a bias. But more seriously, there are two things which are substantially different when we compare the US in the 18th century and Europe now. The share of public expenditures on GDP was tiny at the time. As you basically saw, federal government expenditure were something like 1% of GDP, less than 1% of GDP without interest. At this point in time, member states of the European Union have very large public sectors which provide very important services to the population, including the social welfare state, which is a characteristic of the way we do things in Europe, which is a social market economy. So from that viewpoint, the parallel does not work. Perhaps more importantly, the next step in European integration is not going to be transform the European Union into a federation. The federal way of doing things was a complete novelty in the 18th century. The system that was built in the United States was a new system. There was no such experience in history for a continental country. What is being done in Europe now is also completely new. What we have in Europe is a set of nations. We have a union of nations, peoples, and citizens where the international rule of law applies. And that's a fundamentally different system from what you have in the United States. Now, although I'm obviously very optimistic, I did emphasize, I hope in my presentation, what I call the fact of the primacy of the national dimension of politics, which means that what offers the hope of working is not so much the six-pack and the two-pack, but the fact that the fiscal compact imposes that those rules and procedures have to apply in domestic national law. And so the institutions enforcing discipline are German in Germany, French in France, and Portuguese in Portugal. The enforcement can only be effective at national level at the current stage of European integration, or so I think. Clearly, the point that I was making, which is very optimistic, is that I stated as a fact that at this point in time, Europe is not, the risk of euro area fragmentation is not a relevant concern in the eyes of market participants, but in lesson 5, I very clearly stated that the process of making the euro area robust in the event of financial stress is a work in progress, and a number of elements, a number of important elements are still to be put in place. And yesterday, or the day before, there was a report on public finance elements of the vision of the future, and those elements, according to the group of experts that put forward proposals on a redemption fund and the possibility of issuance of euro bills, involve treaty change. And treaty change is the equivalent of constitutional change in the US. So, but again, thank you very much for your comments. They were very helpful. There are a number of things that I will check with you bilaterally tomorrow.
Right.
Very good. So we can turn to questions from the floor.
Thank you. Muito obrigado. I want to ask your opinion.
Would you please tell me who you are?
Alfonso Diaz.
Thank you.
No institutional affiliation. I want to hear your thoughts about three apparently unrelated episodes, particularly the last one that I will mention, and how they vote for the objectivity of the credit agencies, credit rating agencies. Please correct me if I am wrong, but in 2008, those agencies didn't downgrade the U.S. debt. Had it been, do you think that had it been another country under the same objective measures of the imminence of default, don't you think that these credit agencies, which are basically Anglo-Saxon center or based here in New York or London, would have proceeded the same way? The second episode is the skirmishes in the Congress of late 2012, and when they were about to declare the possibility, apparently, of default was imminent as well, yet the agencies, apparently, from what I remember, didn't downgrade the U.S. debt either. Or was it just, do you think, theater, political theater? And third, the one that looks unrelated, but do you think that from an objective point of view, the downgrading of Russia's debt right after the, whatever you call it, Crimea, let's call it just Crimea, was objective or had some hidden agenda behind it? Thank you.
I'm definitely not an expert on credit rating agencies. If I were to give an example of an area where the credit rating agencies failed, my example would be the rating of products based on housing loans and the market that develop around those activities of credit rating agencies. And there is empirical evidence that I regard as convincing in a recent book by Charles Calomiris and Stephen Haber, where they show that they quote research that shows that the rating of those products does not seem to be comparable with other ratings given by the same rating agencies and having to do with, say, plain vanilla corporate debt. So that would be my example of a major failure from the credit rating agencies. Now, I have absolutely nothing to say about the Russian example. I don't know enough. Concerning the US, what I would like to say is that, as I stressed very much in my presentation, according to what I believe is a reasonable perspective, the US has a stellar track record in terms of making sure that the public debt is served. The U.S. has never defaulted since the start of federal debt, which is a track record which has no parallel in the world. Now, clearly, during this period of more than 200 years, there have been episodes of stress, but precisely this track record shows that there have been very important difficulties that the U.S. political system has proven capable of overcoming.
Very good. Next question.
Roger Gordon, UCSD. You've made clear the challenge that Alexander Hamilton faced in coming up with policies to deal with the large inherited debt following the War of Independence. But I think that those challenges pale really beside the challenges that Europe faces now. I mean, most of that debt was national. And the problem they faced was convincing taxpayers to finance repayment to those who lent to the government in the past, but largely you're transferring from one pocket to another, the same people. Those who pay taxes now are those who lent previously. And it's a mutually beneficial policy to ensure the creditworthiness of the country. The country could smooth financing and firms face a stable currency. A lot of the issues in Europe are redistributional ones. I think that was the main challenge that Hamilton faced as well. That when he absorbed the state debts, that was quite controversial. Some of the states had much more debt than others. My recollection is New York had much more debt than other states. And that was the real hurdle he faced in implementing that policy. And when you absorb state debts, then you're redistributing often between very different groups of people. Now from Germans to the Greeks or other components within Europe. But Hamilton made that task easier by absorbing past debts, but not trying to do the same in the future. And there are plenty of bankruptcies of cities and counties in the US since then, with no attempt by the national government to help out. But the anticipation of it can lead to distorted incentives, encouraging people to take on these debts with the possibility that the national government will bail them out. And that's something that I think Europe still faces, to the extent that it's trying to help the struggling country through their current debt crisis. And the same thing happens if you try to take on the debt of banks, which was a major source of the problem in Spain and Ireland. Again, there's conflicts of interest. You're having people in some countries bailing out the shareholders in another country, and you're leading to distorted incentives in the future on banks to take on risk because they may face implicit insurance through the national government. If you're bailing out firms, and this happened in the Asian crisis, in Korea, that government had implicitly been insuring the debts of Daewoo and other firms, and when it defaulted, it no longer had the revenue to fulfill that implicit promise. That brought on the financial crisis. And the same types of conflicts can exist there as well, which Hamilton did not really face in the problems he had. And so the question is to what degree Europe can overcome these additional challenges beyond the ones that Hamilton faced.
Thank you. So it's a very long comment, which is hard to comment. I will try to be ordered. My impression is that the fundamental distributional tensions, which are associated with the repayment of public debt, were very much present in the United States at the time of Hamilton. That is, one of the issues that was most difficult was the decision by Hamilton to propose that the external debt, that external creditors would be paid in full, and to propose this market-based debt service reduction scheme for domestic creditors. So there is the, I would say, domestic versus foreign distributional concern, which is always present in this type of operation. Then there is the distributional conflict between the holders of public debt and the taxpayers. And it is a fact that taxpayers are in general poorer than the holders of public debt. Now, this distributional issue was prominent in the US debate at the time. The perception at the time was that Alexander Hamilton was very much aligned with the interests of the holders of public debt and the financial system in general. And that point was actually argued quite violently in the US at the time. Now, clearly, those types of distributional issues are also being faced in Europe at this point in time, and the political debate around those is very lively. Distributional problems are the hardest problems to solve politically. As you indicated, Alexander Hamilton proved able to mobilize coalitions that made the implementation of his program viable. However, these coalitions, in some cases, did not persist over time, and there were a number of reversals that took place after the fact. The no bailout of states, that is, the idea that there would be no mutualization of state debt in the US was, I believe, not clear at all until the 1840s. In the 1840s, there were a number of states that enter into financial difficulties. At that point in time, the possibility of a second federal bailout was discussed, but Congress decided against it. That is an episode that Richard Sylla and Thomas Sargent discuss in some detail, is an episode of fundamental significance. In Europe, and this is my last remark, the type of moral hazard problems that you pointed to having to do with how to discipline national governments, how to ensure that banks have the right incentives, figure very prominently in the debate. And the rules of the European resolution mechanism for banks with very explicit rules for bailing in the creditors of the banks, and the debate around the political prerequisites for the possibility of issuing euro bills or forming a European debt redemption fund focus around mechanism design issues of the sort that you raise. Clearly, at this point in time, the concern about how to control for moral hazard figures at the very center of the European debate.
Any more questions? Yep, Ricardo.
So Ricardo Reis here from Colombia. So one question, Vitor, is that, I mean, the US, while you've repeatedly emphasized has never defaulted on its debt, did benefit for quite a few centuries of a central bank who was willing to use inflation to create the necessary state contingencies in debt that allow you to indeed pay less when they may be optimal exposed. We do live now in Europe in certainly a policy regime in which we take price stability as being a very important part of the mandate of the ECB, and that is a big difference from what the US was even, say, 100 years ago. So to what extent do you think that keeping to the debt, if one is committed to price stability, and therefore to not use the inflation option to adjust the debt burden, makes it harder for Europe to therefore create the type of institutions that Hamilton and the US afterwards initiated?
It's a very good question. If you take the full period that we're talking about, the Federal Reserve System has only been in place for about half the period. And from a historical viewpoint, the type of constraints on the conduct of fiscal policy that are now prevailing in Europe are similar to the ones that prevailed in the US during the commodity standard period, right? And the US did not default during that period. So I do think that the lessons hold. Now, the point is that if you want, the way I would answer the second part of your remark is the following. If a country wants to participate in a monetary union like the euro area, there are a number of institutional prerequisites that have to be in place, and those include the realization that the constraints on public debt sustainability are precisely because of what you said, more severe than what they would be in case the national central bank would be able to accommodate to a greater extent specific contingencies that would recommend more flexibility. In Europe, the mandate of the European Central Bank is to maintain price stability, and that is something which takes precedent over other considerations like the support of economic policies in the euro area that include the type of financial considerations that you mentioned.
Any other questions? Yes, there is one. Guillermo?
My name is Henry Nass. I live on the Upper West Side. I wanted to know, both relating to the EU and to the United States, when you have a new player, which is bigger or potentially in the next decade anyway, bigger than both of them, China, where that's going to, how that's going to change the whole calculus of the thing. And if you have China and Japan being the biggest holders of foreign American debt, you know, why isn't that more of the discussion now?
The 2 points that you make are very different to my mind. When it comes to holdings of U.S. public debt by Chinese entities, that is something which seems to be in the best interest of the two parties in the transaction. So it should not pose particular challenges unless you have a weak spot for conspiracy theories. Now, the other issue is, I believe, much more interesting in the following sense. The competition that we're talking about is not the competition in trade, it's competition in finance. And that lags the economic developments and trade developments that you relied on to make your point. So the process that you outline as interesting for the type of issue that we are discussing here will come out, I believe, later. Why? Because in order for the currency of China to become an international standard and China to develop as a continental financial center, it will have to undergo structural transformation of its own financial system before. And those processes are difficult and take time. So the dynamics that you're talking about are likely to play out not immediately, but in subsequent decades. So are not, to my mind, relevant for the here and now. Guillermo?
Guillermo Calvo, Columbia University. No, I was just wondering whether the fact that at the time, Hamilton time, there was a threat of a foreign invasion. There was a common enemy, if you wish, a very serious one at the time, whether that did not help in uniting the different states behind Hamilton's proposal. That's number one. Number two, I wonder, who were the creditors? Were the British were important creditors at the time? I mean, if that's the case, I mean, you're collecting money to pay to your potential invaders. How did that work?
Your two questions are actually very much related. And your second question answers your first question. That is, it was not particularly easy for Alexander Hamilton to justify that among the creditors he wanted to pay were precisely the English creditors that were the potential invaders, right? So from that viewpoint, I think it made it harder, precisely for the reasons you indicated in your second question. But an argument which was very much used by Alexander Hamilton was that the US, America, would be repaying the French and the Dutch that actually helped to finance the War of Independence. So it was almost like a moral obligations. We were in a moment of dire threat, and these foreign creditors believed in us and financed us, and so they're deserving creditors. That argument was used by Hamilton. And that's it.
Okay. I'll just ask a quick question. You know, the point you're making at the end that Europe is progressing but still not there quite, we've been making for a number of years now. So the question is always, why are we still progressing only? And, you know, Hamilton accomplished things within a certain number of finite years. And so whether, as all these questions in a way are indicating, don't we have some more fundamental structural problems, including the population not quite feeling that they really need to have a strong union within Europe, which I guess the US at that time did feel that they wanted to and wanted to have. And if so, what is needed? I mean, does Putin have to take over all Ukraine, or you know, what will what will it do for us 2 years from now or 3 years from now, not to have the same conclusion that you know, things are improving, but we're still not there?
But that's for sure. That is, at any point in time, an open society is always evolving and progressing. We don't close issues in open societies, right?
But we accomplish certain things.
We accomplish something.
Yeah.
Some things, but of course we have other challenges. Challenges evolve. Institutions in our societies are perpetually evolving, hopefully improving, but that's not always the case. So that's one point. Clearly, the challenges ahead of Europe are particularly pressing at this point in time. We have a substantial part of banking union achieved. There are a number of aspects which are not quite closed. We could go through that. On the other dimensions, the fiscal union, the economic union, and the political union, progress has been much less, and there is even debate about what exactly does that mean. So you're right in general, and you're right in particular. But at this point in time, it does look that the likelihood that the process will be successful is much greater than any time in the recent past. Concerning the issue of centralization versus decentralization, or the primacy of the center versus the states, that was very much a debate in the United States at the time. And you could even, I've read that you could even interpret the evolution of the US political system in the 19th century as gravitating around this particular question. That is, people were in favor of a strong federal government versus people who were in favor of states' rights. And the bipolarization of the U.S. Political system had, according to some, the origins in particular this type of debate. In Europe, I think you see that there is a recognition that some problems can only be solved at the level of the Union, while people praise the primacy of the national dimension of politics. So you have exactly the same tension.
All right. On that note, I think we'll thank both of our panelists. Thank you very much.